Welcome back to On the Fly podcast, powered by Massachusetts Youth Lacrosse. I'm Joey Picard, joined by Coach Martin Bose and a very special guest in Coach Tom Mariano from Pace University. You know, something I haven't talked about much on this podcast is why I love Mass Youth Lax and pour a lot of time and energy and passion into MYL projects such as this one. And it's because as a league, they are unapologetic in their commitment to the athlete experience, to teaching this game, but more importantly, life lessons and developing all kids who try this sport. I really think it's an organization that's second to none. And I think today's topic is absolutely on brand with everything that they promote. Today, we are talking about team culture. Now, listen, this is a platform for coaches. These are casual conversations that bring coaches together to share stories and ideas, to challenge one another, to lift each other up. And today, we're challenging our peer coaches to recognize and appreciate and endorse the fact that it's the role of the coach to forge that positive team culture in which all kids have the capacity to learn our sport and thrive in their community programs. Nothing's more important than that. So we'll be talking today about creating culture, maintaining it, embodying it, and we have a terrific guest to lend his thoughts and expertise. So it's an honor and a treat to have Coach Tom Mariano join the panel this week. Quick little bio from me. Coach Mariano is entering his 13th season as the men's lacrosse head coach. He's also assistant athletic director at Pace University in Pleasantville, New York. Previous coaching stints include Sacred Heart University and in the MLL Florida Launch, where he was MLL Coach of the Year in 2016 and also had coordinator roles with the Ohio Machine and the Chesapeake Bayhawks. Coach, welcome. I just hit a lot of the bullet points on your very impressive resume, but would you be so kind as to give us a greater sense of who you are and what drives your passion for lacrosse?
Thank you guys for having me on. Obviously excited to be here. Any chance you get to talk lacrosse. Obviously I've known Marty since he was a young buck and have a great respect for kind of who he was as an athlete. And honestly, it's been really cool to watch him grow into his next role and next layers. And, how can he help? I mean, honestly, I think, we could end this really quick if every organization followed kind of Mass Youth Lacrosse, the principles. We'd be great. We'd all be good. Obviously, we know that's easier said than done. I love all the things you talked about. I think that, resume wise, kind of, you get to a point where you coach long enough. This is my 33rd year as a college head coach. I've been fortunate to not be at too many college places. I kind of tend to stick around. I don't know if that's good or bad for everybody. Had a chance to be with a bunch of different pro teams, head coach of the Florida Launch, head coach of the Chesapeake Bayhawks. So I think what that guarantees is I'll never be a head coach in the PLL because the last two teams I was a head coach of got canceled. And I use that joke quite a bit. But I think it all comes back, right, from a love of the game. A couple of years ago, I got a chance to work with the Haudenosaunee with Lars, Tiffany, and Scotty Marr, and Chris Doctor, and Darby Palace, and Vince Longboat, a couple of native coaches who I still talk to all those guys all the time. Had a great experience from the international game, which was such a different game for me and being around. And then recently I decided, since I didn't have enough things to do, that I would get involved with Korea lacrosse and maybe try to help a country, which has been really interesting. The food's phenomenal. The flight sucks. It is long. I don't recommend flying 29 hours to be there for 3 days to coach lacrosse. Definitely I would have loved to have done that for 14 days. But, the one thing that I learned, whether it's in Mass, New York, Connecticut, lacrosse players who love lacrosse and play the game with passion are a lot of fun to be around. And I was blown away by the passion for the game in Korea. If you really want to treat, go watch some of on YouTube, some of their sixes games. The commentators are explosive. They're wild. It's in Korean. First of all, I don't know what anybody's saying, but just energy, like they love lacrosse the same as players love it here in New York. The same as the guys I've coached youth to college to pros like Marty. They love the game and the passion for it. And it was, at the first Saturday I got there, we're in these literally like rice fields. We're in the middle of like South Korea. I'm literally like 40 minutes from North Korea, not far. And I mean, I was exhausted, jet lag. And you put me on a field with a whistle and a practice plan. And man, it was like coaching Marty or coaching against him in college. Like it was exactly the same. So I think that hit home to me.
How did that come to be? How did you become the head coach of Team Korea?
They kind of posted something, and I've always tinkered around with it, kind of like, I really enjoyed the international game, the culture behind it. These different countries have such a different culture. New Zealand's the haka. You watch some of the Ghana and some in Kenya, like they're dancing and they're just so happy to be playing lacrosse. And I saw Korea and I was like, I've never been to Korea. That would be kind of cool. And I started a relationship with them and just talking to their board and going through. And I just looked at it, it's not just a chance to coach lacrosse, it's a chance to, because they only know what they know. A lot of especially their domestic players, there are a lot of Korean Americans, which is great, more than you realize. But they are grown on their domestic players. They're kind of Korean players. So they only know what they know. And I just felt like, man, I could, maybe help them look at a different way, help them elevate, take the next level. I think, on the world stage, you look at like Japan over the last 10 years has went from like kind of like an okay team to like they're challenging the big boys. They're good. And I think that, the KLA, the board wanted to, give it a shot and try something different. And then it's interesting as I go through the process, and one of the main guys who was behind this on the board, he actually went to the same prep school as I did. So it was just kind of like a small world.
Small world.
So I think for me, it was just a chance to, kind of give back to the game. Figured it'd be pretty cool to go to Korea, which it was an amazing country. I would highly recommend it. But certainly, like I said, don't fly 30 hours to sit there for 3 days. Take like a nice 10 to 14-day vacation. But really just to help grow the country. I mean, after our first weekend, guys are coming up to me like, just thank you. These are like grown men. Also, too, most of the, all the Koreans that have passport have served in the military. They've been on the line with North Korea. Like, it's a different viewpoint. And you just see it in their eyes how much they loved just having somebody different. I threw some drills at them that, I think the first minute they probably thought I was crazy. And it was probably awesome that half of them couldn't understand me. And I couldn't understand what they were saying because they were probably telling me I'm dumb. And this is the dumbest drill ever. And then once it got going, they're like, the light bulb went off. Like, wow, this is an awesome drill. Wow, this drill is making us actually move off ball. So from that perspective, I think it's been a blast. I have weekly Zoom calls with the staff. Clint and Tony are just energetic. Mo's are, there's just so many people who want to help, who want to grow the game. And I think when you meet that kind of passion, how can you not want to be a part of that?
Oh, that's amazing. And that's just a nice segue to talk about team culture, because a big part of that has to be passion, right? Instilling that if they don't have it already. And a lot of these kids do. They come in really excited to go. And so we can channel that and we can build it in others. So why don't we jump right into it? If the three of us sitting here now were responsible for creating a positive culture on a youth lacrosse team, let's say we have a blank canvas right here, and we had a magic wand, meaning we didn't have to put any work into it. We just said, here are our values, our beliefs, our behaviors, our norms, and presto, that positive culture was in place. Marty, I'm going to start with you. What does it look like? What is our positive culture for this team?
I would have to break that into 3 categories. I'm going to go discipline. That can be a tough word because I think some people assume like you're disciplining a kid because they did something wrong. What I mean by discipline is sort of the ability to do things you maybe don't want to do even because it's the right thing to do and to do it consistently. So discipline, accountability, and focus. Those would be my 3 main pillars to, hey, if everyone can sort of embody those 3 things, the sky is the limit. And I have the flexibility as the coach to throw a lot of different things at a group that can embody those 3 values. These are 3 things I've gotten from my martial arts sensei. And so they're kind of just a part of my being at this point. And yeah, that just feels like what feels right to me.
Coach Mariano, what would you add to that? What would you take away from that?
I think that stuff is great. I think, for me, before you get into the pillars, I think it's like, what do you want out of this? As a coach, as a program, what are you trying to accomplish? Why are you doing this? Why are you coaching these kids? Because, we know it's not for the money. Most of these positions are volunteer. So it's like, why are you doing it? What are you trying to get out of it? What do you want the kids to get out of it? And I think that before I get into pillars, right? Because the reality is with some of these, you might see a kid for 90 minutes a week. And yes, you want to instill pillars and, to Marty's point, discipline and accountability. But like, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to win like the World Series, youth lacrosse tournament? Are you trying to, be the number 1 ranked team as a 2042 in the country? You're not focused on the process. And I think that's where the what and the why. And I think that I've been around the game a long time, and I've got 3 children who all played youth sports, and I have a son who's going through youth sports. I have a daughter who's a senior in college, and I've seen a lot of different things. I've coached a lot of different things. I'm sure there's plenty of parents and players out there have different opinions than me. But I think for me, it's, the kind of what and why. When that kid shows up, we have no idea what his day was like. We have no idea what his home life is like, are his parents getting divorced? Did someone just pass away? How does a 8-year-old process that? His parents are forcing him to be at lacrosse. He doesn't want to be there. He wants to be home playing Xbox with his boys. Maybe the kids on the team were bullying him at school. We don't know any of those things. But when we're coaching, that matters. In that 90-minute segment, that all matters. And how do you get everybody kind of moving forward? And that's where I think, for me, to Marty's point, the pillars come into play. But are you there? Let's say tonight at 7 o'clock in an indoor session, are you here to win a lacrosse game? Are you here to help these young kids figure the game out and figure out how awesome? I think I look at it, right, and we all would agree with this. This is the best game there is to play, because it's the only game that is created and literally has special meaning to us, the creator's game. I don't know, the first time you show up to youth practice, isn't that important to impact that on those players? That you're not just playing lacrosse. This is the medicine game. Because like you said, if you have 20 young little kids there, boys, girls, doesn't matter. They each have a different story. And you're not going to connect with all of them in the first 5 minutes, but why not try? Why not create an environment? Why not create a culture that's going to connect with those young kids? But Marty will tell you, if we're going to fourth grade practice, it's no different than showing up to a pro practice for the first time. You've got to connect so many different people. And as you get older, there's egos and power and this and that. And everybody's got an opinion. A lot of 8-year-olds, the only opinion they have is they want to be there. They don't want to be there. They're not sure if they want to be there. And are they cold? Is it hot? That's the only opinions they have.
And
Are they hungry?
does their teammate's helmet work? Let's give it a try. Whack!
Yeah. Oh, cool. I can slash this kid in the head as hard as I can. And then the mom sends in a mean email that, Marty's picking on Joey because he slashed him in the head. And you're trying to explain, well, he didn't do it on purpose. That's a lot in a short period of time. You just, it's like that's a giant sandwich to eat, to digest. So, just impact the kids in a fun and positive way.
Right.
Make it fun. Make it so they want to come back.
Absolutely. So I heard in there relationship building and a higher purpose. We're going to add to Marty's pillars of discipline, focus, and Marty, throw me the other one again.
Accountability. Yep.
Accountability. That's a big one. The only other one I want to add, and we've talked about this in a previous episode with Coach Chris Gugino, was the vulnerability aspect too. The kids not being afraid to try things and make a mistake. That whole idea of fail, and that's okay. We learn something from that. That's how we grow. So don't be afraid to try. Don't be afraid to put it in your weekend. Don't be afraid to try a backdoor cut. Don't be afraid to set a pick. See what happens. Play around in the laboratory, and then we'll talk about, did it work? Did it not? Did it feel forced? Did it feel natural? Let's keep playing, because that's what this is ultimately about. And then, of course, I also heard Coach Mariano, you talk about how we're kind of honoring the roots of this game. It is a very special sport. One of my favorite times of year is when I get to tell the story. And so my 8th graders have heard it 8 years in a row, but I get to work with the young kids and I get to tell them, you have any idea how special it is to be a part of this sport, and dating back thousands of years, and why they played it and why we're carrying on that tradition. So those are all amazing. So I want to ask this follow-up question. These are the beliefs and the values that we've instilled with our magic wand. How do we think that team performs?
Well, I'll jump in on that. Honestly, if the kids are having fun and want to be there, you're going to be pretty good. You're going to be successful. Now you didn't hear me say you're going to win, because at that age, I don't care about that. That's not, there's too many people worried about winning at these young ages. There's a time where, and I get it, listen, winning matters, I get it. You spend $12,000 a year playing club, winning every game matters. I get all that. But like I said, if the kids leave and they tell their parents, I can't wait to go back to that practice. I can't wait to go see Coach Marty and Coach Joey. When do I have practice? When's practice? Because I tell you what, they're not asking that about other things. And if they don't like it, like I remember my son's first football practice. The first practice he ever showed up. He played lacrosse and other sports. They did like 2 hours straight of conditioning. It's like the beginning of August. Like, this is youth. This is like 8, 9-year-olds. I'm with a couple other dads, and we're looking around like, oh boy. We get in the car, and I was like, so what do you think? He was like, that was awesome. I can't wait for the next one. I'm looking at him like, okay, all right. Because I literally thought he was going to get in the car and be like, I never want to go back. Like, it's like 95 degrees, sprinting, rolling, monkey roll. Like, and he just finished his last year in the league with like 17 touchdowns. Like, has turned into a really good. But I remember the first practice ever, 4 years ago, I was convinced he was never going back. I was convinced. So I think to me, Joey, that's like, there's a time and place for winning, but I just think at the youngest levels, I just don't think there's too much importance placed on that.
Agreed.
What you
Mario, what
just
do you
said
think?
is, I mean, what you just said, Coach, is just so in line with the values of MYL, and it's embedded into our whole system. So it's really, really refreshing to hear you say that. And one thing that you also reiterated is like that they want to come back, and that's kind of how we define success in some regard. So I think that being the one of the pillars of like, hey, if every kid is excited to come back, that's how we can kind of put the context of success. I think we're doing all right.
For sure.
Well, I mean, isn't the goal of youth lacrosse is to get these kids to love the game and help them get better and prepare them for the next level, whatever the next level may be. But
Sure.
who knows? Like a fourth grader, does that mean he's going to Duxbury? Does that mean he's going to Andover? Does that mean he's going to Belmont? I don't know. As a fourth grader, I had a parent at a camp once. The kid was a seventh grader, and the mom was like, "Well, what prep school should he go to? Because he wants to go play Duke in Virginia." He's like, "Do you think he's good enough to go?" I'm like, I just had one session with your son. Like I said to her, that's a lot of pressure on me. Like he looks like a good player, but those prep schools aren't going to guarantee he's going to Virginia or Duke to play lacrosse.
Think about the kind of pressure that he probably feels at home. If you felt that after one camp session for an hour, that's the mindset that we're hoping to kind of change, and make sure that these parents, coaches, everyone understands these kids are youth for such a small period of time. Let them enjoy it. Let them grow, develop. You're going to be shocked to figure out who's just going to have that growth spurt, that interest spurt, and be a superstar later in life. And they came to that first practice in fourth grade in jeans and crying and snot dripping down their face, and they didn't want to be there. And that's the superstar. And then that kid who was all gung ho and had the best equipment and all the autographs fizzled out because it was just too much pressure. I mean, everyone's different. So there's so many different storylines that get us there, but we got to keep it in perspective. So, can we make the case, the argument that these soft skills, and I think that's such a misnomer calling them soft skills anyways, but these things that we're teaching, accountability, passion, vulnerability, focus, discipline, are these more important for us to teach than the hard skills like a roll dodge or, a bounce shot? We can make that case, can't we?
I don't know. We've all, you know what it's like to teach third graders like a roll dodge, especially like beginning third graders.
Not easy.
It is not easy. It is not for the meek. I think that gets a lot of coaches questioning, why am I doing this? Because I'm not getting paid enough to do this, or my volunteer. But I think to your point, can you teach them an accountability on, calling ball release on a ground ball, picking the ball up, dropping your butt down, getting your bottom hand down, head up on the ground ball, moving it right away? Because you can always say to them so much, well, if you don't move it right away and have your head up, you're going to get killed. And then the first time they get crushed in a game, they look at you like, darn, he was right the whole time. I think that, those hard skills, and I think that, I think your culture is how you drill and your drills are your culture. So I think at that young age, teaching them the basics, how to stand, how to cut, how to be a good teammate, how to share the ball, right? This game is all about the ball. So ground balls are really important. And I think, Coach Marty talked before, discipline. I don't know if there's a better discipline teacher in the game of lacrosse than ground balls. Because teams who lose struggle on ground balls. They don't do the right thing. Teams who are successful are really good on ground balls at any level. Youth to pro to worlds. Then I say that, but at the same time, the Canadians completely throw that out, who, by the way, might be the best country in lacrosse right now. I hate saying that.
Yeah, they are.
But when you watch like a second, third grade box practice, it's all about their hands. It's all about timing. It's shots. It's skill. And then they just, day after day, week after week. Yeah, and that's why they are talented. The scary part for Canada is I think that their defensemen have finally caught up to their offensive guys. For years, I think USA would beat them because Canada always had good offense. They didn't have goalie play. They didn't have defense. They didn't necessarily have face-off. Well, they have all that now. But I think in the box game, and, I think that's a whole different segment. In the box game, it's the amount of touches. In a field game, right, we're doing line drills, which I don't care what age you are. Like, I think doing line drills with young kids is just asking for trouble. You're going to turn around and 10 of them are slashing each other in the head and drop kicking, kids suplexing a kid, RKO and a kid in the back of the line. Where Canadians in that short field is, they probably get thousands of more touches than our youth kids do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I make the comparison from soccer to futsal. I think the Canadians get the benefit of, right, just more touches. And, to bring it back to your original question too, Joey, like I think makes me think of a very specific story around the very first meeting we had, Coach Mariano, as a team. So we're in some, ballroom, in a hotel in Florida, and you had a presentation prepared, and we're all sitting there, and you pop up the presentation, and I guess I had more expectations than I realized, and I was kind of thinking like, all right, like, we're going to get into like systems and, game strategy and like, what kind of offense and defense we're going to be running and this, that, and the other thing. And I remember one of the first slides you put up there was be where your feet are. It was all about presence and showing up and not letting, what happened leading up to this and what you're worried about happening later affect your ability to perform right now. And I thought that was a powerful message. And I think it's relevant to this question of like, if you lead with those quote unquote soft skills and you're showing that you're prioritizing it as the leader of the group, that has a powerful ripper effect. And I mean, that stuck with me. I'll always remember that.
Yeah. And we said this is about preparing them. It's preparing them for the next level. And there's massive truth to that. I'm always thinking about, okay, I'm teaching 5th and 6th graders. What's 7th and 8th grade lacrosse like? So I can get them ready for that by the end of the year. And with our 7th and 8th graders, we're starting to say, hey, high school is a big jump. It's a lot different. It's a lot more independence, longer sessions. You need to be ready for it. You need to be ready for that accountability. But we're also preparing them for life, because nothing that either of you said in terms of focus, discipline, accountability is going to harm these kids in their vocation when they pick a career and any other sport that they might play and passions. I mean, we have an opportunity to shape these kids in 3rd and 4th grade, give them good work habits and work ethic. That's going to serve them for life, even if they drop a lacrosse stick in 5th grade. We've still passed on enough to them that we can say, hey, this culture helped this kid. It might not be on a lacrosse field down the road, but it helped this kid.
Yeah, man, I think to your point, right, you'd love if, when that young kid is 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and they're like, man, I remember when Coach Joey taught me this, Coach Mariano talked to me about this. They're not going to remember all the lacrosse stuff, but they are going to remember some pillars and philosophy stuff, and they'll remember kind of the life stuff. And I think that stuff matters.
Amazing. Okay. So there's no magic wand. That's the thing, right? There is no magic wand. There's no incantation that we can say, no seance we're going to hold in the cemetery after dark and poof, we have culture. This is something that takes work. It takes leadership. It takes vision. It takes practice, trial and error. So this is a podcast for coaches who are jumping into this. Does this happen like over time, this team culture? Are there little baby steps that we're taking and it organically grows? Or are there like big giant leaps that we can take early on to kind of establish this optimal environment? Because now we're getting practical here. Well, how can we get our culture in place?
Well, I think, I'll jump in on, I think both answers are correct. You're going to take baby steps, but at the same time, you're jumping right in. Like your first practice, what's the first drill you're doing with those kids? What's the tone setter? What are the vibes going to be like? The kids are going to feed off of you. And that's why, I think I struggle. I think, a lot of times one of the first things people do is they put them in like a line drill. And listen, it's a great drill. It's been around since the dawn of lacrosse. It might have been the first thing that the natives did, line drills. But we know they didn't. They went out and played. They had a little catch and they went out and played. What's your vibe going to be, right? All the kids talk about, oh, good vibes, coach. I don't like the vibes. Like, what's the vibe going to be in your first 3rd grade pro? What's the first drill you're doing? I wouldn't recommend doing Oklahoma drill, but that would get the juices flowing. That would get the people moving, maybe some music at practice, like a lot of it's herd and sheep. They all want to go in different directions. And, I think it's that first impression. When they come up, do you interact with them or I don't know if the first thing you say to people is like, this is my field. You're going to do this my way. The vibes go right down. And I love that about coaches when they say, this is my field. I've never met a coach who bought the field, who paid for the turf. I think of the line with Spicoli, right? And Fast Summer Ridgemont High. This is our time. This is our field. I think we got to have that approach as a coach, but certainly it's small steps, but then it's also big steps. Like, man, just jump right into it. Jump right into it and lay it out there. It's okay to have them, talk to the kids first. Short talk, because we know their attention spans are like gnats with their phones and Snapchat and TikTok. Like, you got to catch them like right away.
So, Marty, before you answer, I want to follow up with this because I was going to ask you, Coach, if it's just you're going to establish your culture by the way that you just drill off the bat, and they're going to pick up on it. They're going to say, okay, the whistle's blown, we're in go time, and here's the expectation. And all right, we're working hard today. And that's the vibe, that's the culture. Or I was going to ask, do you set these expectations verbally at all? And I love what you just said. You got to keep it short. You can't deliver a 10-minute speech to these kids. You got to give them in 30-second Instagram clips. But is it something that you verbalize? Hey, this is who I am as your coach. This is what I believe in. Meet me there. Let's do this together. Is that something that you do?
100%. I think, listen, with the technology of today, we all have access to all these cool things. Put your, I don't want to say rules, because I don't really believe in rules. I believe in more standards and expectations. Put your standards and expectations on paper. Get it to the parents so they understand, like, hey, we've got an hour to practice. If you show up half an hour every single day, you're losing 6 hours over a month, whatever it is. So I think, that'll eliminate some of the time, because the reality is you've got a short period of time, and, people are paying for their kids to play. People are showing up for their kids to play. They're not necessarily, if people wanted you to speak, they would pay you to speak, to be a speaker. Hey, we're going to pay you to speak to the team for an hour. Yeah, they want to see their kids play. But I certainly think you got to get the kids on the same page. Like, we've got to, like I said before, it's a vibe thing. Like, hey, this is my vibe. This is your vibe. It's not always going to be connected, but let's kind of meet in the middle.
Love it.
Marty, jump in.
My answer to this question is surrounding storytelling. And I think that there's if there's a way to keep the attention of a group of kids, it's through storytelling. And I've been lucky enough to coach with Lyle Thompson a few times. And one of the pillars that he talks about is respect. And it kind of touches all these different aspects, because respect can be, respecting your opponent, could be respecting your coaches, respecting the referees, right? Respecting your family, respecting the game, right? And all that touches. But then he also talks about respecting yourself. And part of respecting yourself is that you're trying as hard as you can. That's actually self-respect, because I think what a lot of the middle school kids get into, not necessarily the younger, K through 4s, but a lot of the middle school kids start getting into like that fear of being seen by other people. And we've talked about this in the past, but it's actually disrespectful to yourself to be like, I'm not going to work hard so that maybe I can make less mistakes. And that value of like, no, like if you go so hard that mistakes are happening, that's a good thing. And the storytelling around that can be powerful. And he talks about how, his elders would sit them all down and talk about what it means to be respectful to this game and respectful to yourself, before they would then just roll the ball out and play, not necessarily do line drills and whatnot, right? So I think, like Coach Mariano said, it's both. It's, you can try to have a powerful impact, especially early on in the connection of the group. But then you also have to show up consistently and prove that you embody the values that you're saying that you're prioritizing. And they need to see that. And I think when you're able to be with a group for, let's say, multiple years, that's when you start to see like the culture really become a more of an established norm.
Why do you think the storytelling aspect resonates so well? Do you think that these kids think that someday they can create their own story through lacrosse?
I do, and this is a skill I really want to work on as a coach and a storyteller, because I've tended to in the past just like talk about why respect is important. But if you're to tell a story about it and like how it would affected you personally, I think there's the aspect of seeing yourself in those shoes, and it just makes sure that the hairs in the back of your neck stand up and you can really connect with it more. So I just think it's a powerful tool that I personally need to and want to get better at, because I've seen and experienced how impactful it can be.
So what do we think are some of the obstacles that are kind of getting in the way of the ideal environment for these kids to just thrive in, giving them their values as we're doing as adults? What are some things that as coaches we're going to run into that says, this is pushing us back a couple of steps?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think, a lot of this stems from ego. It could be ego from the kids, ego from the parents, a combination, ego of the coaches. There's nothing like going to a youth tournament and it's like, give it to Marty, run to Marty, go to the goal. And everybody else stands around, and Marty's really good. And Marty had 7 goals and we win 9-8. but the other 5 guys didn't play lacrosse that day. They didn't get better. I think that's a huge obstacle at the youth level. And then it's, it comes back to TikTok and Snapchat and instant gratification. And I got to be on the best club team. And I got to be, and listen, I think there's so many great things about youth. I think there's many great things about club lacrosse. I really do. But it's like everybody's chasing for the next big thing. And I think going back to Marty's point, like be where your feet are. Be where your feet are. Like I don't know, if you're there at practice, man, have fun, play as hard as you can. To Lyle's point, right? Like respect yourself. And I go to games and I'm a spectator and I don't say much. Like when my kids are playing, I just kind of watch. And after, I don't say much. The only time I'll get a little animated is if especially my son who does know the game, he likes to argue with officials at time. And his point is like, well, am I wrong, Dad? I'm like, no, but that's not the point. Respect the game. But it's more like, did you have fun? Did you play hard? Were you a good teammate? And listen, I've seen some things in this. I've seen things in the parking lot that would horrify you of parent interaction with kids. And that's ego. That's ego. And that's going back to, do you think that kid really wants to play lacrosse because he knows he's going to get screamed at because he didn't score goals? If you score goals, great. Maybe that's what you're good at. But let's not judge a fourth grader on how many goals he had. He might have had 5 goals, but he played a terrible lacrosse game because he didn't pass the ball to Johnny, who was wide open. And it's Johnny's birthday, and it would have been amazing for Johnny to score a goal. His grandmother's there for the first time we've seen it. Like, going back to what I said, we don't know the stories. But I think that, Marty hit it right in the head, man. Respect the game, respect yourself. And I think at the end of the day, were you a great teammate today? Did you yell at Marty? Did I yell at Marty because he dropped a pass when he's wide open? Or did I say, hey, Marty, you're open. I'll keep throwing to you. You'll get the next one. Are we lifting up our teammates? Something I said to my college guys today, rising tides lift boats. Why? Shouldn't that be important at the youth level? Shouldn't that be one of the most important things?
Oh, 1,000%. Marty, what do you think of the obstacles that you're going to encounter?
To me, the biggest is difficult parents. And I think, like Coach said, it's the ego. And I'm so grateful for, the upbringing I had. And I think about some of the things that my mother would tell me. And I laugh about it now because she basically would be like, if a teacher or a coach ever tells me you were doing something wrong, I believe them. You were wrong. I'm not going to have your back. Like she would just tell me that and be like, she'll have my back and that she loves me and everything. But if I'm going to give some excuse of why I did what I, why I think I was justified, she's like, I'm not hearing it. And I think that I see less and less of that from parents today, where they'll hear from a coach, a sturdy leader of a coach, of like, hey, your kid was he was really being disruptive today, and he was slashing kid in the shins, and just being kind of a jerk, and they'll go and they'll ask the kid what happened, and they'll get some story from the kid, and they'll come back and be like, well, he said this and that. And it's like, that's a problem. That's a serious problem. And to me, that feels like the biggest hurdle. I don't know. I don't have the answers, but that's where my mind goes.
So it's right on topic. I mean, it's right. It's 100%. I mean, I hear 2 answers in there. I'm hearing ego. It's the me show. It's about me. I'm going to run through 2 or 3 defenders when the right play is making that extra pass. But I'm also kind of hearing that disruptor, and that might be apathy. That might be, I don't really want to be here. I don't care. I'm not having a good time. So I'm going to make sure everyone else around me is also not having a good time. And we've all seen that, in these kids before. So I guess my next question would be, when you have these abnormal behaviors, things that are going against what we've established as our values and our best practices and our norms of what our team's about, let's talk a little bit about discipline. And let's talk about the discipline that you're not talking about, Marty, at first. This is the one where, how do we maintain that culture? Is it better to catch the flies with honey, or is it better to catch it with vinegar, or is it a little bit of both? And depends kid to kid.
I'll jump in here just because it's fresh for me. Like, I think timing really matters. If something like that is happening and you're watching it happen and you wait 2, 3, 4 minutes to go, decide what you think you should do about it, I think that's a mistake. It's not okay for a kid to be slashing other kids in the shin. That's not okay. That kid needs to be removed from the fun pretty much immediately, so that they know that if that behavior continues, there's a consequence to that. And they're not a bad kid because of that, but that's really, really not okay for the other kids. I think that the timing matters. And, I'm in it with parenting, right? I've got twin 3-year-old boys, and it's like, I gotta make sure I follow through on what I say. So, being sturdy as a leader is just so important. And so the honey versus vinegar conversation, I think, is it's a spectrum. I think of it as like kindness and firmness. All right. I can be both. And some kids really need a high amount of both. And some kids will respond to, a really, really supportive version of me because maybe they're, going to get a little bit more fearful and kind of go into their shell if I come in a little bit too hot. So I need to read that as I go. But I think it needs to be centered around the timing of like act quickly and have a plan of like be okay with removing a kid from the drill for a couple of minutes, but don't go put them in timeout. Like go sit with them and be like, look, man, like I want you here, but what you're doing is not okay. Are you ready to come back into the team drill without doing what you were just doing? And kids even at the kindergarten and first grade level, they're ready to hear that, and they know what you're trying to say. So yeah, that's where my mind goes.
Coach, before I get your take on this, I just wanted to say, Marty, that I just read something recently about Swedish school discipline. They had a lot of problems with kids fighting in class and being disruption. And the go-to for teachers is get out, right? You're on suspension, you're detention, go see the principal. But they started a new thing where they would keep them in class, but just have them sit quietly for a few minutes thinking about it. And the phrase that kept coming up, which I loved, was your emotions are louder than your thinking right now. So take some time to think about it and when you're ready to come back. And I think that's so much more valuable than just pointing a finger and saying, you're tossed. That's it for you today. It's just your emotions right now are louder than you're thinking. I think that's a brilliant way. I think that's kind of along the lines of what you're saying as well. Coach Mariano, do you have a take on this?
Well, I think, listen, I'm an older guy, right? But I think when I was younger, if you disrupted the class, you got kicked out. If you really disrupted, they sent you home. I'm not saying me, but maybe some people I knew thought that was awesome. Like
Yeah.
in-school suspension was great. Out-of-school suspension was even better. I'm not saying that was me. I'm saying for somebody else. But and then I look at to Marty's point. I think it's the delivery, it's the timing. A kid who's really hostile and upset, screaming at him to get off the field. You're on my field. That's not how we play the game. You might as well just throw a firecracker at him and M80 because he's going to blow up. But if you call him over and say, hey, why don't you get some water? Hey, why don't you stand next to me? You're still coaching the jokes. You got paid. If you got other coaches, maybe you pull them aside and be like, hey, what's going on? What's up? Because if you like to Marty's point, if you're going to play like that, I can't have you out there. You can't be in the drill. I certainly know you wouldn't like Joey to slash you in the face. And you just slash Marty. I know you're better than that. You good. And sometimes a kid might be like, nah, I'm good, coach. It was an accident. Or, that kid's a dick. I can't stand him. Or, I'm sorry, coach. I had a bad day. I didn't mean to do it. Sometimes these situations get out of control and they become big. And then next thing you know, some parents send the email that Joey's a terrible human and he tried to kill my son. And, literally Joey just accidentally slipped and didn't know what he was doing. Or you know what? Joey is a little dick and we've got to correct him and help him. That's going back to the storytelling, figuring out their story. But I definitely think more honey than vinegar, but they certainly have to, understand consistency. And, consistency in the execution, to Marty's point, of how you handle it. They're all watching that. They're all watching how you react to an incident. And you know what? I don't care what level. I mean, you look at pros, right? If you don't throw the ball to a wide receiver, he's complaining. If you bench him and he loses a paycheck, he's very upset. So playing time always hits everybody where it matters. You can get their attention. Because the reality is, if a kid's out of control and kind of hurting people, he can't be out there. He doesn't learn the respect of the game and respect for his teammates and respect for his opponents. He hasn't learned that yet.
So that's really great advice that both of you bestowed. I'm going to ask a follow-up that I'm going to answer first, just so you guys can take a little time and think about it, because I'd like to ask what lessons we've learned from doling out discipline, like when it didn't go well. And so the first thing that I'll throw out is I used to, in my early years of coaching, and I've been coaching for about 21 years now at the youth level, I used to assign laps, go run, go for sprint, run around the field, go ahead. And I forget if it was another coach or a parent, but someone pointed out to me and they said, pretty soon they're going to start to associate the running with the punishment. And this is a running sport. And so since that was a light bulb moment for me when I said, you know what, you're right. We need to get these kids to learn to love to run. And I haven't figured that out yet. I haven't figured out how to get kids loving to run. But the kids who don't mind and do embrace the fact that this is a fast sport, tend to do better. So I've since not assigned laps to do so. I now, kind of take a little breather timeout mode. If it's really bad, we'll have a conversation with the parents.
I think to your point, right? Sometimes the first reaction is an emotional reaction, and it's emotion like go run. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but that's more of an emotional thing. And
Right.
is that really coaching? What are they learning from that? And listen, sometimes there's moments where kid just needs to take a timeout, but I think those type of kids like running, it doesn't bother them.
Right.
They're like, whatever, I'll go run in the fence and back, and they'll be even more defiant if that's what they're going. So I think we've all experienced that lesson, and I think that I think it all goes back to the kind of what you're doing and why you're doing it. I think that and figuring out how you can kind of reach each person, reach each individual, and hopefully inspire them and help them. If they don't have, listen, the best kids to coach are the ones who have respect when they show up from day one. The hardest kids to coach are the ones who have zero respect. To Marty's point, we could keep bringing this up, but I think that's a big thing. I'm not sure making a kid run because he slashed a kid in the head is going to teach him respect.
Yeah, I think the principle that comes to mind is, it's already been discussed a bit, is connection before correction. It's like, it's the same reason you don't, send a kid away by themselves. It's like you want someone to be connected with that kid to maybe get a little bit more context as to what's going on with them. And that there's that like trust and that ability to be vulnerable with a sturdy adult. But removing them from the fun is the consequence, maybe for the kid that isn't having fun in the drill. So their version of fun is slashing kids in the shins. It's like, I need to make sure that stops, if that's going to be, what their activity is, that can't continue. You're putting other kids in danger. Yeah. Connection before correction, because, just barking orders and saying, cut that out. It may work because they're scared of you, but that's not sustainable.
So one last question for me before we get to some other ones. We've talked a lot about the roles and the responsibilities of us, the coaches, the adults, the mature ones, right? We're communicating our expectations. We're exhibiting our values. We hope, right, that we're not being hypocrites, that what we say we're also doing. But in what ways can we actually utilize the players themselves? So I'm talking about like the peer leaders who kind of model that desired culture. What are some things that we can do to highlight those kids that are modeling that culture? And is it just simply pointing and saying, hey, look what Hunter's doing, or is it a little bit different than that?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can provide peer kind of peer positive pressure, I think pointing out like this is like you're calling the guys in after drill and say, hey, Marty, you were awesome in that drill, you working hard, you did everything the drill needs, and sometimes what'd you think of the drill? Well, asking them to explain what they're, and that's a tough one. That's a tough, kind of story. I think we talk about storytelling, but I think it's important for these young kids to tell some stories on their own, to feel comfortable talking in front of their peers, to feel comfortable talking in front of their teammates and coaches. But, certainly, there's a difference between yelling at a kid because he didn't hustle and, encouraging him and lifting him up. And I think that as a coach, it's important that we acknowledge that and see that in kids, and don't give like a practice player of the day or the scrimmage, the game player of the day to the guy who scores all the goals. You want to send a message on your culture and how you want to do things. Give it to the guy who had like 3 ground balls and no shots, but he worked hard in every single shift. He tried. Maybe he wasn't perfect. Maybe he made a lot of mistakes, and you follow up like, hey, he had a great week of practice, really happy with what he's doing. We're excited to see him next week. You think that kid will want to come back on Monday? That kid probably want to come back if you're rewarding, Marty, who goes to the cage every time and takes a left-handed shot down the alley and scores 5 goals because Marty's really good and athletic and he's just better than everybody else. I don't know. Do we need to acknowledge that hey, you did a good, Marty, great job scoring 5 goals today. Tommy, awesome job. Hey, Joey, it's your, second game ever as a goalie. You had a great save, though. That one off your shin was awesome. Stuff like that. Like, I think that those are big culture pieces, and, acknowledging and getting them to all feel good about what they're doing.
I coach with a guy who's established this years ago, and it's a great tradition that we have. He brings a little cooler with Prime bottles. The kids go crazy about Prime, and he gives out 3 a game. He gives one to the goalie every time because it takes a special thing for a kid to come into the net and perform as our last line of defense, taking those shots. But he gives one out to most number of ground balls picked up and most number of assists. And I really love that. That was kind of initiative that he took. And it, because we know the kids who score the goals, especially the game winners and the ones that matter, they're going to get the glory. They're going to get the chest bumps and the high fives and the parents. So when we could acknowledge things like the hustle, the ground balls, the assists, things that made that play happen, sometimes our poor defenders kind of get left out of everything. So I try to make a big deal about when we create turnovers or when we've made our assignment, when we slide well, because they don't always get the statistics glory that the others do. But that's just one thing that one of my coaches does that I love that he does. And I think anything we can do to symbolize, the effort plays, I think goes really well. Marty, do you have anything like that?
I do. Just it's actually something I picked up from you, Coach Joey, which is asking players to call out positive things they've seen in their teammates. Right? Like, can you guys name one thing that a teammate did that impressed you today? And I think that's a true telltale sign of like the culture getting there when you're able to get 5, 6, 7, 8 responses of kids calling out the things that we would hope they would, not just like, hey, he scored the game-winning goal, that was awesome, but like, yeah, I noticed like, he messed up. He lost that ground ball, but he hustled back on defense. Like, you get a kid to say that about another kid. That's pretty powerful.
So we do that after every practice, and we pick 2 kids and we have them stand up in front of everybody, which, as you said, Coach Mariano, that's not an easy thing for a kid to do, a 10-year-old to stand up and talk in front of his peers. And we'll ask each of them, hey, pick a teammate and say what you appreciated about them today. And I half thought the first time I did this, it was going to be along what Marty, you said, Connor, he scored the game winner. So, he gets my vote. And I was blown away and surprised and proud that it wasn't that. It was, at practice today, he knocked me over in a ground ball, but he picked me up. He gave me his hand and he lifted me up. And I really loved that. One thing I heard from a kid who's just my absolute favorite, this is my go-to captain type level player, is he said, I beat him in this ground ball one-on-one every time, but he never stopped fighting. And that's why I'm nominating, Max for this award today, because, even though I had the better of him, he's a newer player, he just constantly came back at me and it made me a better player. That's out of the mouth of a 10-year-old. That's mind blowing to me. And so that's why I kept that tradition going. It's a great one to have. I encourage all to do something similar. Get the compliments coming from the peers. I think it's more impactful than coming from the dads and the adults.
That's powerful. I mean, I've worked with a youth coach. Mike Wright is a teacher. He runs Buffalo Lacrosse out of Buffalo, and he's an elementary school teacher. So he knows how to deal with these kids. He used to come work our Nike camp at Sacred Heart, and he would do a lot. He would have all these young kids just sitting, telling stories and talking, and begin the week, you get the shy, quiet kid by the end of the week, and like that stuff's powerful. Like I said, I don't know if those kids will ever remember the drills they did, but they remember those moments and kind of feeling good and the empowerment. To your point, providing a vehicle to show their passion and their care, because and Marty said this earlier, and we are, especially when they get to middle school, those are all negatives. You're a hardo. You're a hardo, which I think is the worst thing I've ever heard, when kids accuse another kid of being a hardo. To me, it's disrespectful to any athlete. But I think, I love that, Joey. I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, we're pretty proud of these kids for sure. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that we got from other coaches here on the subject of team culture. And if we missed anything, we'll have one final chance to put a bow on all of this. But it's been a great, enlightening conversation already. But a couple of last final questions for any of us. So if you have a good answer, throw it out. Number one is this: besides playing together a lot, what other ways can teams create chemistry?
I'll talk from my just memory of different teams I played on. I mean, the pasta parties at people's houses, the pizza parties at, even if it's just at a parlor. Obviously, there's a monetary aspect to that, which can be challenging. But, breaking bread together, sharing a meal together is so valuable. I remember some of those things, like you said, Coach, like more than some of the drills we did. I remember some of the, just basement hangouts that we had at a friend's house because, we had a big game the next day and someone stepped up to, host a pasta party or what have you. So that seems like a really low hanging fruit. And I don't remember doing much of that at the youth level. Maybe we could do a little bit more of that.
That's kind of a high school thing, right? And same, yeah. I was thinking my answer is like the bus rides is always another good bonding moment when you're on that bus getting ready for the game. And then on the way back, whether it's glory or sorrow, you're doing it together, but you don't really always see that with youth. It's everyone gets a ride there from mom and dad. So, but to your point, it's off the field stuff as much as it is. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you know how you learn about your team is you go to a tournament and you have a 2 hour break. You can see everything you want to know about your team in that 2 hour break. And I know a lot of coaches and parents are flipping out when the kids they're all playing lacrosse, they're playing football, they're chasing each other, they're playing, they're spending time together and laughing, or are they all sitting on their phones? Are they all splintered off with their parents? They're doing different things. That tells you a lot about your team culture. And to Marty's point, right? Like there's, the little kids, man, they look forward. I'm not sure they're looking forward to the tournament. They're looking forward to seeing what the snacks are.
100%.
Do we have good snacks? Do we have healthy snacks? Do we have bad snacks? And God bless the parents who are wonderful. Some of these spreads are ridiculous. They're better than weddings. I've been to weddings that didn't have spreads as good as some of these tailgate games.
Charcuterie boards and shrimp skewers.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I think, if you, and we're all, you guys all chuckled, but I think that if you have a good culture and your team, really cares about each other, they spend in every second they can together. If they're off on their own, like if Johnny's with his mom, Joey's with his dad, and they're not sitting next to each other, I don't think that's good. I think they're missing the point of this. And so to Marty's point, I think, you do these overnight tailgates, 2 days, like everybody getting the team together. The parents are having fun, the kids are having fun.
That's amazing. The only other one I'm going to throw out there, I'm going to shout out to one of the MYL town programs, which is Shrewsbury Youth Lacrosse. I remember I wrote an article about them a couple of years ago when we had our magazine. They would do a service project together. And whether it was they'd clean up the field, they'd pick a Saturday and they'd go and make sure all the wrappers and water bottles, or they did a clothing drive. And, not as fun as hanging out in the basement after a pizza party, but I still think it bonds them for a higher purpose. And I think it sends a great message that, we're also respecting, our field, our playing area, and our community. So Shrewsbury does that, I think, once a year, at least they used to. I hope they still do. And I just love that they did that. And I also encourage our youth coaches to think about those things as well. What can your community do? And here you have 20 boys or girls who are willing to roll their sleeves up and help. And that's another great thing that youth sports teams can do as well.
There's something that I've seen a little bit lately, which, when I first saw it, I think part of me was like, I don't know if I like that. But the more I think about it, I think it's amazing. There's some club teams out there that are doing media days with their teams. And at first, when I first looked at it, I was like, The more I thought about it, I'm like, this is amazing. It's the winner, and they're getting their team together in their uniform, taking pictures, smiling. You never see anybody not smiling in those pictures. Everybody's happy. I think it's a great way to bring guys together. And I think that, like your organization, it would be hard to pull off, but I bet you'd be amazed at how many smiles and how happy the kids would be to see each other. And it's not lacrosse. They got their uniform on. They're taking an individual picture. They're taking a team picture. Maybe they're taking a silly picture. I think I've grown to love that concept. I think it's actually I think it's really cool.
Yeah, that's
I think
cool.
It's a great way to collaborate and, connect in the out of season.
I would say on top of that, I wouldn't wait until you win a tournament. I would just pick a day and do it. Do it at the halfway point of your classic season and say, this is our team media day. And we're going to have pictures.
They're even doing it like my son has one the Saturday after Thanksgiving.
Awesome. That's great. That is a cool concept.
And, I don't think enough teams are doing that. And I'm like, I think it's really cool, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, if you ask a college kid right now, one of the best days of the year for them, there's a couple great days in the fall. Halloween, anything associated with Halloween weekend is a great weekend. And they love their media days. They go all out. Costumes, apparel, it's I think there's probably a lot of coaches like, oh, what are these guys doing? What they're doing is they're smiling and laughing with their teammates. Isn't that what we want from our team and our players?
Absolutely.
And then they have pictures. And you know what? At the older guys, they bust each other's chops pretty hard, which is a lot of fun in itself. We don't want that with the youth, but
we have a cool tradition in my town program where our 8th graders design a uniform every year. So every year we have a different uniform. We somewhat have a color palette scheme that they have to stick with. We can't all of a sudden wear Hingham red colors. That'd be a big no-no. But other than that, the 8th graders kind of, they all submit designed ideas, and then they vote and they pick. And then we have a huge program-wide uniform reveal day where they come out in it, and then the high schoolers will hand each one of our youth players their uniform for the season, and we get the backdrop and we take team photos. So that's a really special thing that we all look forward to, as well as the big uniform reveal. And that's kind of at the beginning of the year to set the tone for the year. So I also like the idea of kind of doing these media days early and get that team chemistry early, and then they can play better together because they've forged these friendships as well.
So one of the coolest things I've ever seen, one of the coolest experiences I've ever seen is, I don't remember what it was. You would probably, when Quinzani was at Duxbury, the long stick who didn't come off the field, who went to Georgetown, Chris maybe, I forget his name. Kid was phenomenal. One of the best high school players I've ever seen. He's up there with CJ Costabile. He literally didn't come off the field. Quinzani was ridiculous in high school. But you go to a Duxbury game and, a bunch of college coaches were watching, and it was almost annoying to watch the game because there were so many Duxbury youth kids. They were everywhere.
Still are.
Thousands of them. And I'm like, this is awesome. They're running around like maniacs. Like, that always stuck to it. We've talked about it in the past, like as coaches, like such a cool experience to see so many little kids. And I think, to your point, the really good tradition-laden towns have that. And I love like what like what you're talking about, the jersey. That's amazing. But then I think if you threw in like a quick little media day, how much cooler could that whole thing be? I'm not sure the older coaches will tolerate that, but those kids will remember that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we still do. We have a wall right near there, so there's a small break in the action. They'll all run to the wall. They'll all come back. They all know the score. It's a cool culture that, and I had nothing to do with all of that. That's well before my time. I just kind of inherited the torch and trying to keep it up. But I know that I'm in the Mecca, and I count my blessings every day, Coach. I really do.
That's awesome.
I got one more. And so we've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but I have a small team and I need everybody to even field a team on game days. So taking away playing time for bad behavior ends up being a punishment for all, since we can't even field a team. So I'm looking for advice on other ways of holding kids accountable for repeatedly poor performance that doesn't include taking away the playing time. So Marty, you got to smile. I know you had a good answer.
One. Yeah. I've mentioned him before. I had an amazing basketball coach in high school, Bob Fisher, and used to run this camp at Bentley University. And he used it with us a couple times at the high school level. But I remember he did this to some kids at camp that were messing around at the dorms. And I've seen other coaches talk about this concept, and it's powerful. So basically, the kid that messed up, they're going to get a little cup of water, and they're going to go sit at the half court. And then everybody else is going to start running suicides. And that kid that messed up has to drink that cup of water, and they have to sit there and just relax. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, shouldn't it be the opposite, right? But it's powerful, if that kid to be like, soaking that in of like, man, everyone else is suffering because of what I did, and I think that can actually be what the message, that gets received. And I think there can be some behavior change from that. Maybe I just think it's funny and a little bit cruel, but that's where my mind goes. I think it's a powerful technique that can be used in certain situations of like, now how can you show that this person is causing harm to their teammates, and essentially that they're being selfish, and kind of just force that, example upon them of like, oh, I'm just relaxing while everyone else runs. Like, this seems backwards, it's kind of confuse them into better behavior.
I think they do that pretty well at Paris Island, if I'm not mistaken, for boot camp.
Yes. Well, I think the other one, if you only, let's say you have 10, 11 guys, let's say you have 10 guys there and somebody's clearly not on the same page, not going to do the right thing. Okay. To Marty's point, go get some water, go sit on the bench. Coach, you don't have enough men. No, we're good. We're good. We'll play with 9 guys. And you look at Johnny, well, the way you're playing right now, you're going to get a penalty, so we might as well play man down. And, I think that, the carrot before the horse, the carrot before the stick. I think, playing time is the carrot and it's the stick. And listen, you might get a kid, like to Marty's point, there's some kids out there who are like, can I get some more water, coach? I'm good. I'll sit here and chill. There's some kids out there like that. And, that's going back to the respect thing. I think a lot of this comes back to respect. But I think as a coach, are we doing a disservice to your team, and you're doing a disservice to the individual by allowing him to play the wrong way, to play with bad behavior? Or do you send a powerful, and parents like, oh, we don't have enough men. Like, no, we're good. We're good.
I like that a lot.
And Johnny, he's not playing to the standards that we need him to play. He's not respecting his opponent. He's not respecting his teammates. We'll just play man down.
Amazing.
You're not threatening the kid. You're not punishing him. You're not yelling at him. Just say, listen, if you're going to play this way, we can't have you out there.
If you're not going to buy in, who needs you? Almost, right?
I mean, if a kid's out there cross-checking people in the face and you're always man down, aren't you man down anyway? So you might as well just get good at it.
Exactly.
Hopefully he'll learn, hey, I want to play. Let me stop cross-checking a guy in the face. There's accidental and there's intentional.
Big difference.
And I think, especially at the youth level, there's very few intentional. But if you do it every game, it kind of becomes intentional. And that's where I think, one of my good friends is coach with me now. He said something the other day. It was pretty powerful. He's like, isn't that the coach's job to help that player get better, to help him understand? I think that, that's the coach's job. And when, we're not talking about roll dodge and pass and catching. We're talking about, honestly, like respect. Stay out of the penalty box because you respect your teammates, because you respect your poor goalie who's getting shelled. He needs 3 prime drinks.
Love it.
So this has been a very enlightening conversation, and it's been a long one, but I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface. You could talk on and on about team culture and how important it is. Any final thoughts that we just haven't touched on before we wrap this one up?
Well, I think, right, when you're coaching, I think this to the youth coaches, it's okay for the players to make mistakes. It's also okay for you to make mistakes. I think, we want our players, we want to empower them to figure out who they are and who they want to be. I think a lot of times as coaches, we're not authentic. We're not genuine. We're not where our feet are. We're not us. And I think it's really important. You're not going to be successful as a coach. Like, I'm not going to try to be Coach Joey or Coach Marty. I got to be Coach Tom. And, I think, mistakes are okay. Fortunately, we're in a society where, and obviously, we're talking minor mistakes. You play the wrong kid, not enough playing time. You got the kid at the wrong position. Coaches beat themselves up over wins and losses, and they'll learn from it. But I think, especially at the youth level, I don't know, go back to, did you have fun? Did you work hard? I'm not necessarily asking, what the coach run an offense? Why do you run that man up play? Why didn't he play you more? Why aren't you here? Why aren't you on attack? If the coach puts you in, you go play hard. But I think kind of for our youth coaches and even our newer coaches, but even our older coaches, like, mistakes are okay. Mistakes are okay. By the players, mistakes are okay by the coaches. As long as you're not crossing the line. Going back to the respect thing. But, like, to me, that's a big part of culture. And that's a big part of how can you get better? Because everything we've talked about doing wrong, I've done wrong in the past. There's sometimes I feel like I'm still doing it wrong. But, you keep trying to learn and you keep correct yourself. I think that's important.
Amen. Marty, what would you like to add?
I think just to build off what you finalized there is, as a coach, we have an obligation to be a student. If you feel like you know it all, you're wrong. And so, to be vulnerable enough to admit that when you make mistakes, you can own up to it. And what you're not changing, you're choosing, right? If there's a mistake that's consistently happening, that is on us, right? To help either a player or ourselves make that adjustment. But yeah, this is really, really, I appreciate you being here, Coach. This is special for me just to be able to spend time with you in this way. And I'm grateful for the time that we had in Florida together. And yeah, it's a powerful thing to, continue to evolve as a coach and as an administrator. And this environment, talking about leadership, you had a really, really powerful impact on me as a pro. And, one of the things that I think a lot of youth coaches can benefit from is, there are certain drills and there are certain overall concepts that apply to kindergartners through professionals. We do some of the same drills. Yeah, it looks a little different and it moves a little faster, but it's not a different drill. It's not a different concept. And that's been powerful for me to kind of, talk to youth coaches and talk to pro coaches like yourself in this environment and try to really sink some of this stuff in. So yeah, thank you. Just a lot of.
No, I appreciate you guys having me on. I mean, this is awesome. Obviously, watching all these young guys. I've watched Marty since he was a freshman in college, and he scored some goals against me and had big games and had tough games, but always respected his work ethic, and it's awesome to see. And I think that in all transparency, like, I think my biggest growth as a coach has been over the last decade. The first decade, beginning of my career, I had no idea. Like, you're figuring it out in the fly. But are you willing to learn? And I 100% have always felt like there's probably a time in my career where it was very much my way. This is my field, and you're like, God, what an idiot I am. That's the dumbest thing you could do. And I look at now, like, I think if guys who played for me 30 years ago watch me coach college now, I don't think I'm any softer, but I'm completely different. And I think it's just learning, and how can you have a connection, and how can you, what kind of relationship do you have? But I think to Marty's point, right, it's been awesome for me watching, guys like you and Stephen Brooks and Connor Busick, who, coaching a pro and had a lot of time with and still talk to, and watching all these guys become great coaches and fathers and husbands. Like, it's awesome. Also says you're getting old, like me, I'm getting old. Because if Marty's getting old, that means I'm getting really old. But I think, it's constant state of learning. Like I said, the book, right? The Coach's Guide to Teaching. I think there should also be the Coach's Guide to Learning. The first part of my career, I didn't do that very well.
I love that. Well, Coach, I just want to echo that and thank you so much for your time today and your contributions to this great conversation on it. I'm just getting to know you for this conversation, first time I've met, but I can tell just knowing Marty and what energy he's brought into this organization that you have established great positive culture in your teams. So we all appreciate that and thank you. And I want to thank the folks at MYL for helping to power this podcast, and to thank our audience, our coaches, our fellow coaches who are listening into the conversation and contributing. It's been an awesome episode of On the Fly. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you next week.